What does it feel like to go looking for trouble and actually find it? A few years ago, a man in his late 30s rushed into our clinic, demanding an expedited paternity test. He was dead silent the whole time, his face a mask of grim determination. When the results came back a few hours later, the word excluded stared back at him. He turned white as a sheet, then his eyes flared with a cold, burning rage. His hands were trembling, so hard the report rattled in his grip. I'd seen this 1,000 times. Usually, they take the report, go home, and let hell break loose. But this man didn't leave. Instead, he looked at me and asked, "Doctor, if I need to collect DNA samples from someone else without them knowing, how do I do it?" I explained the various types of samples he could collect and the proper methods. He listened intently, nodding slowly, before turning and walking out the door without another word. A few days later, he was back with a new sample. Again, he paid for the rush service. The result was the same. Excluded. The man looked completely lost. "How can it still be excluded?" he muttered. He asked if there could be a mistake. But I assured him our results were definitive, unless there was a rare genetic mutation, something almost impossible. Then he leaned in and asked a darker question. "Can you tell from the child's DNA if the parents are related, like close relatives?" He was actually wondering if his wife had cheated with one of her own family members. "I'd need a sample from the relative to be sure," I told him. Sure enough, he returned a few days later with a third sample. He didn't say who it belonged to, but I knew it had to be a male relative of his wife. When the third report came back, once again excluded, the man finally broke. He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands, literally pulling out clumps of his own thinning hair. "Then who the hell is it?" he whispered. After a long silence, he finally opened up. His name was David, and his wife was Sarah. To everyone who knew them, they were the perfect couple. David was a solid, successful manager at a local firm, and Sarah was beautiful, kind, and a devoted homemaker. David believed marriage was a balance of values. He provided stability and status, while Sarah brought beauty and warmth. It was a perfect equilibrium, or so he thought. There was one thing that always bothered David. Sarah was too nice. She was a people pleaser who couldn't say no to anyone. She had an ex-boyfriend named Mark, whom she'd dated for 4 years. They only broke up because Mark had gambled away all the money they'd saved for a house. Soon after, Sarah met David. She was drawn to his maturity and stability, and they fell in love quickly. But Sarah refused to cut ties with Mark, believing that 4 years of history shouldn't just be erased. David hated it. Mark was a chronic gambler, a loser. To David, there was no such thing as just friends with an ex. They fought about it constantly, until David finally set some ground rules. No long conversations, no calls after 10 p.m., no venting about their marriage to him, and no deleting chat history. Sarah agreed, and for a while, life seemed to return to normal. David figured as long as the chat stayed innocent, he could live with it. A year later, they were married. 2 years after that, their son was born. But the happiness David expected was replaced by a grim reality. During the pregnancy, Sarah had been an emotional wreck. She told him she wasn't ready to be a mother and was terrified of failing the child. She even wanted to terminate the pregnancy. David, wanting to support her, almost agreed. But both their families were dead set against it. David's father, in particular, was adamant. Sarah was forced to go through with it, and for the entire 7 months, she was trapped in a deep, dark cloud of depression. After the baby was born, it only got worse. She suffered from severe postpartum depression. She blamed David's father for forcing her to have the child, and took her anger out on David every single day. Sarah wouldn't let David's father anywhere near the baby, insisting her own mother move in to help instead. David endured it all. He stayed quiet when she screamed at him, or even when she insulted his father to his face. He thought if he just worked harder, if he was just more patient, Sarah would eventually get better. But then, she stopped talking to him altogether. Conversations were reduced to one-word answers. Yeah, okay, whatever. The intimacy was gone. She insisted they sleep in separate rooms, claiming his snoring kept her awake. Worse, Sarah's mother took her side, suggesting David should move out for a while to give her space. That was the red flag for David. Why were they trying so hard to push him out? He pretended to agree, saying he'd stay at a hotel near his office. But instead, he secretly installed 2 cameras in the house, one in the living room and one in Sarah's bedroom. That's when he saw it. Sarah and her mother were constantly whispering together. And Sarah had a second phone, one David had never seen before. She was constantly texting someone, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying. One day, when Sarah's mother was out shopping and Sarah was in the bathroom, David managed to find the hidden phone. It was locked, but then the screen lit up with a message. Hey, my sweet Sarah, you there? The name on the screen was one David would recognize anywhere. Mark. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He walked out of the house, trying to keep his head from spinning. He replayed everything in his mind. The reluctance to have the child, the depression, the isolation, the way she pushed him away. It all clicked into place. Sarah had been seeing Mark. She'd gotten pregnant, and that's why she wanted an abortion. She wasn't sure whose it was. When his father forced her to have it, she realized the child looked like Mark. That was the real reason for her depression. David decided to get a paternity test. When it confirmed he wasn't the father, he went after Mark. He managed to get a sample from him, but to his absolute shock, Mark wasn't the father either. David was a well-educated man. He knew the results didn't lie. But if it wasn't Mark, then who? Sarah rarely left the house. Her social circle was tiny. He racked his brain until only one other person came to mind. Kevin. Kevin was Sarah's cousin. He was tall, handsome, and lived in the same city. They were close, too close, in David's opinion. Sarah was always going out for lunch or shopping with him, claiming she was just helping him vet his girlfriends. David had always thought it was weird for a cousin to spend that much time with her. But he'd kept his mouth shut. Now, it seemed like the only logical explanation. But then the test results came back for Kevin. Another exclusion. Kevin wasn't the father either. David sat across from me in the clinic, looking completely defeated. I don't understand, he said. She barely saw anyone else. How is this possible? I was just as confused. If Mark and Kevin were both out and David was out, where did this child come from? Are you sure there was no one else? I asked. David thought for a long time. There was one night, he said finally. It was Mark's birthday. Sarah insisted on going to see him. She said they were just friends, and she'd feel bad if she didn't go. She even sent me a photo of them at a karaoke bar with a group of friends. I figured since it was a public place with other people, nothing could happen. I just told her to be home by 10. So you let her go? I asked, a bit surprised. I didn't have a choice, David sighed. She would have made my life hell if I said no. But I demanded we stay on a video call the whole time. She agreed, but after about 30 minutes, she said she had to go to the bathroom. The call dropped. I tried calling back, but she didn't answer. I drove down there and found them sitting close together, singing a duet. She was home by 10:30. She was only with him for about an hour total. And you think something happened in that 30-minute gap. It's the only time she was ever alone with him, David said. But we already knew Mark wasn't the father. And her cousin, Kevin, I asked. He stopped by a few days later to check on her mom, David said. But that was it. We both sat there in silence. It felt like the child had just dropped from the sky. There had to be someone else, someone we were missing. Suddenly, a bold and disturbing thought flashed through my mind. David and I had both overlooked something obvious. I looked at him and asked tentatively, "When your mother-in-law was sick, were there really no other men who visited her besides Sarah's cousin?" I deliberately emphasized the words, "any other men." David's eyes widened, and his face turned from red to a sickly pale green. "There were 2 more," he stammered, his lips trembling. "One was my father-in-law and the other was my own father." "You know what I'm getting at," I said, my voice grave. "Tell me about your father. You mentioned earlier that his situation was a bit complicated." David nodded and finally opened up. His father was a successful businessman who had made a lot of money. But he was also the living embodiment of the phrase, "money changes a man." When David was young, his father was constantly unfaithful, leading to a messy divorce. David stayed with his father, while his younger brother went with their mother. After the divorce, David went off to college, and his father, now completely free of any responsibility, began living a wild, playboy lifestyle. He had a revolving door of girlfriends. David had met at least 7 or 8 of them, and there were likely many more. This was the main reason Sarah didn't want her father-in-law helping with the baby. She was afraid his loose morals would be a bad influence. Currently, he was living with a woman he actually planned to marry, which David strongly opposed. David then recounted his father's movements during the week Sarah likely conceived. When Sarah's mother fell ill, David's father arrived that evening. He didn't leave immediately. He stayed overnight and didn't head back until the following afternoon. David looked up at me, his voice desperate. "Doctor, it's impossible. My father would never do something like that." I asked him why he was so certain. "Because Sarah's mother was home the whole time," David insisted. "How could anything happen right under her nose?" "Are you absolutely sure they were never alone?" I asked. David's face regained a bit of color as he nodded firmly. "Yes, I'm sure of it." I thought for a moment. "Who handled the errands?" "Who went to the grocery store?" David paused. "Sarah did. Her mother wasn't well enough. So Sarah did all the shopping and cooking." I pressed further. "And are you certain she went alone?" David's face turned from flushed to a cold iron gray. He sat in silence for a long time before whispering, "You mean they used that time?" "It's a possibility," I said gently. "Sarah could have easily made an excuse to send her mother to rest while she went out, or vice versa. Think back, who introduced you to Sarah? Was it someone your father knew well?" David's eyes went wide. "A very close friend of my father's." He stopped mid-sentence, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "No way. He's my father. He couldn't have set this whole marriage up just to stay close to her, could he?" I quickly tried to de-escalate. "I'm sorry, David. I'm not trying to accuse your father. I'm just looking at the possibilities based on the facts we have. It doesn't mean it's the truth." But David was already spiraling. Then he remembered something. "Wait, the test proved the baby isn't mine." "If the baby isn't mine, then it can't be my father's either, right?" I shook my head. "Paternity testing isn't that simple. While we excluded you, your father's DNA is different. We can't rule him out without a direct comparison." "I understand," David said, his hand slowly clenching into a fist. A few days later, he returned to the lab with a new sample. I already had a gut feeling that this would be the match. In my mind, I had constructed a sordid story. Sarah and David's father were former lovers, and the father, unwilling to let her go, but unable to marry her himself, had orchestrated the marriage to his son to keep her within reach. It sounded like a cheap soap opera, but given his father's reputation, it wasn't impossible. We ran the expedited test again. A few hours later, the results were in. To my absolute shock, it was another exclusion. David's father was not the biological father of the child. We had ruled out David, the ex-boyfriend Mark, the cousin Kevin, and now even David's own father. Who was left? Was this some kind of freak genetic mutation? David, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly reached into his pocket and pulled out another sample. "Doctor, there's one more. Please test this one too." I was speechless. Who else could there be? Then it clicked. There was one more man involved in that week's events. I probed slightly, and David admitted the sample was from his father-in-law, Sarah's own father. When he had left my office a few days ago, he decided to cover all his bases. If his own father wasn't the match, he would test hers. David was determined to find the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. I stayed late that night to run the lab work myself. The result was once again baffling. The crazy, twisted scenario David feared hadn't happened. Sarah's father was also excluded. Every man Sarah had been in contact with during those critical days had been tested. And every single one was a negative match. I explained the situation to David, who looked completely defeated. He slumped in his chair, rubbing his balding head, his spirit crushed. He was ready to give up and accept the genetic mutation theory. But then a spark of memory hit me. "David, I have one more question," I called out as he was about to leave. He turned back, looking confused. I chose my words carefully. "When you went to pick up Sarah from that karaoke bar, was it just her and Mark? Or were there others?" David's expression soured. "There were others. If it had been just the two of them, I would have done more than just yell at her." I asked how many men were there. "I didn't count, but at least 4 or 5, he grunted. Suddenly, David's eyes went wide. "Doctor, you don't think something happened with one of them, do you?" "That's impossible. There were so many people there, men and women, and they were only alone for half an hour." I tried to calm him down. "David, just listen. Does Sarah have a tattoo?" He looked startled. "How? How did you know that?" I told him not to worry about how I knew. "Just tell me, what's the design and where is it?" "It's a plum blossom," David whispered. "On her chest, right in the center." I asked if any of the other women at the party had tattoos. David shook his head. "I don't know, I didn't notice. I was so angry seeing her with Mark that I wasn't looking at anyone else." I felt a pang of frustration. If I couldn't confirm if the other women had the same tattoo, I couldn't know if Sarah was linked to a specific group I had heard about. Then I remembered the photo. "David, didn't you say Sarah sent you a photo before you went to the bar? Do you still have it?" He quickly pulled out his phone and found the image. It was a typical scene from a dimly lit karaoke room, smoke in the air, people dancing and drinking. There were 2 other women in the shot, both dressed for a night out. I leaned in and looked closer at the woman in the foreground. Nestled right in her cleavage was the exact same dark green plum blossom tattoo. "Look at this, David," I said, pointing to the screen. "This woman has the exact same tattoo as your wife." David's jaw dropped. "What? What does that mean? Why would they have the same one?" I looked him in the eye, my voice serious. "It means the father of the baby is almost certainly one of the men from that night. I can't tell you everything yet, David. It's late, and we've both been working for 30 hours straight. Go home, get some sleep, and call me when you wake up." David didn't want to leave, but he could see I was exhausted. He reluctantly agreed, making me promise not to turn off my phone. After he left, my mind began to race. I was thinking about a mysterious criminal organization. A year earlier, a police officer friend of mine had busted a ring that specialized in honey traps, scams where women would enter relationships or marriages specifically to extort money from men. It was a coordinated team effort, with different people handling everything from the initial meet to the final payoff. These groups were professional. They had employees for every role, including specialized staff, just to handle messages on dating apps and social media. The beautiful women were only there for the face-to-face meetings, which allowed them to juggle dozens of targets at once. They would milk their victims for money and gifts before abruptly ending the relationship or even getting a quick divorce. Sarah's behavior and that tattoo were pointing toward something far more dangerous than simple infidelity. According to later statistics, a small organization of fewer than 10 people managed to scam over $3 million in just over 3 years. And those are just the cases we know about. Many victims were too embarrassed to come forward, so the real number could be much higher. It's a staggering amount of money for such a small group of criminals. The way they came together was quite scandalous. They started as a small, degenerate group that met regularly just to satisfy their own desires. Over time, they became very close, like family, sharing everything with one another. Eventually, someone had the idea to use fake relationships or marriages to scam people out of their money. Lacking any moral compass, they all immediately agreed. That's how this heartless marriage scam ring was born. I remember Officer Reed telling me that all members of that organization had the same tattoo. They had all gotten it together during one of their early parties, just for fun. Little did they know, that very tattoo would eventually become a key piece of evidence used to identify their criminal syndicate. Looking at David's experience, Sarah's reactions, and the plum blossom tattoo on her chest that matched the woman in the photo, I suspected they might be part of a similar group. If so, it wouldn't be surprising if Sarah had been with one of those men at the karaoke bar. I immediately called Officer Reed to report that a mysterious organization might be resurfacing. Reed, who I woke up in the middle of the night, sounded surprisingly calm. After I explained the details, she sounded more amused than concerned. "Is it really that big of a deal?" she asked. I was stunned. "A criminal ring resurfacing is a small matter to you. What are you basing this on?" she countered. "Just a plum blossom tattoo." "Of course not just the tattoo," I argued. "Look at how Sarah and her mother have been acting. And the baby could only belong to one of those guys from the karaoke bar. No normal person acts like that in a public place," Reed sighed. "You're always so impulsive. Let me ask you a few questions. First, the members of that old ring were all in their 20s. Sarah's mother is over 40. Why would she be involved? Second," Reed continued, "the old group's tattoo was a religious symbol, not a plum blossom. Statistics show that butterflies, roses, and plum blossoms are the most common tattoos for women, especially on the thigh, waist, or chest. It's likely just a coincidence that Sarah and that woman in the photo have the same one. They could just be friends who went to the same artist. Third," she added, "scammers usually take the money and run or file for divorce within months of the wedding. David and Sarah have been married for years, and now they have a baby. Does that sound like a marriage scam to you?" As Reed went down her list, I started to break out in a cold sweat. Her logic was hard to argue with. "And most importantly," Reed said, "have you even asked David if he's actually lost any money?" I was speechless. I forgot. Unbelievable," she sighed. "You call yourself the local Sherlock, yet you miss the most basic clue. Money is the motive for every scam. If you don't even know if he was robbed, you have no case. Don't call me again tonight, unless it's a real emergency." After she hung up, I lay on the couch, reevaluating everything. Reed was right. My imagination had run wild with the criminal ring theory. It didn't hold up under scrutiny, but one thing I was still sure of. The baby's father had to be one of those men from the karaoke bar. Sarah wasn't just a girl who couldn't say no. She was hiding a much darker side. Thinking about how she secretly kept a second phone to contact her ex, I realized she was far more capable of deception than David thought. If she was that bold, then losing control after a few drinks was entirely possible. It was the only explanation that made sense. I picked up my phone and called David again. He answered on the first ring. He hadn't slept at all. "Doctor, I've been waiting for your call," David said urgently. I cleared my throat. "David, I need to ask you about the money. Throughout your relationship, how much did you actually spend on Sarah and her family?" He paused. "Well, I paid for everything while we were dating. Dinners, trips, gifts. Maybe a few thousand a month. The engagement gift was $50,000, and her jewelry was another $20,000. And since we've been married, he continued, I give her father $2,000 a month for his poker games and $3,000 to her mother for groceries. That's about it. That's all, I asked. The house and cars are in my name, bought before the wedding. I felt a knot in my stomach. This definitely wasn't a marriage scam. No one spends years for such a small payout and no claim to the major assets. So what about the tattoo? David pressed. I had to think fast. The fact that your wife and that other woman have the same tattoo means they've known each other for a long time. They likely partied together. In that kind of environment, things can get out of hand. David's voice dropped. You mean, my wife's past was much wilder than I thought. Exactly, I replied. You should focus on your next move, instead of chasing ghosts. I can't just let it go, David shouted, his voice filled with pure hatred. I have to know who he is, or I'll never have peace. He hung up, leaving me in silence. I figured the drama would end in a messy divorce, something I had no interest in following. But not long after, Officer Reed called me back, her voice crackling with excitement. You won't believe it, but you were actually onto something. What happened? I asked, my jaw dropping. Is the family part of a scam ring after all? No, Reed replied. It's not about a scam. It's much worse. It almost turned into a murder case. We have them in custody right now. She then told me about a series of shocking events that had just unfolded. A few days ago, the police received a report of a brutal assault in a high-end apartment complex. The victim was a woman in her late 30s named Lisa. Someone had poured boiling hot oil directly onto her face, causing deep, horrific burns. Medical examiners confirmed the injuries were severe and would result in permanent disfigurement. Under the law, such a cruel and calculated attack carries a sentence of 3 to 10 years, or even life, depending on the circumstances. It was a truly heinous crime. The perpetrators were a mother and daughter who lived next door to the victim. Normally, this wouldn't be Reed's case, but when she saw the file, she immediately recognized the address. It was the same complex where David and Sarah lived. When she turned the page to the suspect's profiles, she was stunned. The names staring back at her were Sarah and her mother. It couldn't be a coincidence. Reed immediately looked into the status of the case. Strangely, the officer in charge told her that the suspects had already secured a letter of forgiveness from the victim. In exchange for medical expenses and a mere $100,000, Lisa had agreed to drop the charges. This made no sense. For a woman, losing her face is a life-altering tragedy. Why would she settle for so little? Lisa was a single mother. Her appearance would be crucial if she ever wanted to rebuild her life or find a new partner. $100,000 wouldn't even cover the surgeries she'd need. Sensing something was very wrong, Reed applied to take over the investigation. According to the initial report, the hot oil incident started with a simple argument. Sarah had barged into Lisa's home while she was cooking. The two women got into a physical struggle, and the much larger Lisa pushed Sarah to the ground. That's when Sarah's mother rushed in. Claiming she was protecting her daughter, she grabbed a pot of hot oil from the stove and threw it in Lisa's face. Neither side could explain what the argument was really about. Reed knew she had to dig deeper. The timing was too perfect, David's paternity test and then this. There had to be a link. Reed called me back immediately. I told her that David hadn't contacted me since our last talk, nor had he come in for any more tests. Based on how he sounded, I figured he'd gone home to confront Sarah directly. For an average guy, tracking down every man from that karaoke bar was an impossible mission. Confronting Sarah was his only real option. Reed agreed. It makes Sarah and her mother's behavior even stranger, though, she noted. Instead of dealing with David, they pick a fight with a neighbor and cause a massive scene. It doesn't add up. She decided not to alert Sarah yet. I'm going to find David first. Get his files ready for me by tomorrow. I'll tell you everything once the truth comes out. I couldn't focus on work at all. My mind was racing with theories. A few days later, Reed surprised me by showing up at my office. She told me to grab my testing kit and come to the station. Did you find the father? I asked, breathless. She nodded. The suspected father is waiting, and this time I'm almost certain we have the right person. You're just here to make it official. As we drove, I begged her for a name. You'll never guess who it is, she said with a smirk. Is it one of the karaoke guys? I asked. Nope, she laughed. I thought for a moment, then gasped. I've got it, it's Lisa. The woman they attacked with the hot oil. Reed looked at me like I was crazy. How can a woman father a child, Sherlock? Hear me out, I insisted. Maybe Lisa isn't a woman. Maybe she's a man in disguise, or someone who's had surgery but kept their male organs. Think about it. As a woman, she could be around Sarah without David ever getting suspicious. It explains why they were together when Sarah conceived, and why Sarah's mother attacked her when the secret came out. Reed gave me a thumbs up. Your logic is flawless, she said, but then her expression changed. Except for one tiny detail, Lisa is a woman through and through. 100% biological female. I slumped back in my seat, defeated. Okay, you win. Just tell me what happened with David. What did he say when you found him? Reed explained that she'd tracked David to his hometown. He was a shell of a man. He told her that after our call, he'd gone home and exploded at Sarah, demanding the truth. But Sarah played the victim. She cried, screamed, and accused him of cheating and making up lies just to get a divorce. Even her mother joined in, calling David a heartless liar. Furious, David threw all the paternity test results in Sarah's face. She was stunned, but still refused to believe them. She insisted on a triple test, testing her, David, and the baby together at a clinic in another city, thinking our lab was in on a conspiracy. They went, and the results were identical. Sarah was the mother, but David was not the father. There was no more room for denial. Sarah's mother actually slapped her in the clinic, screaming about her filthy lifestyle. Sarah just sobbed, insisting she'd only been singing at the bar and nothing else happened. David couldn't take the acting anymore. He abandoned them at the clinic, drove home, and moved back to his parents' house. He didn't even know about the hot oil attack until Reed showed up. David remembered that Sarah and Lisa were very close, and Sarah often visited Lisa's apartment. Lisa was a kind, single mother living with her 10-year-old son. David couldn't imagine any conflict between them. Reed realized that Lisa was the only one who knew the truth. When she finally confronted Lisa, the woman's story fell apart, and the horrific reality finally surfaced. We arrived at the station. Reed sent me to the medical room, where an officer was waiting with the suspect. I walked in, looking for a grown man, but the only person there was a young boy. Maybe 10 or 11, quietly reading a picture book. I looked at the officer, confused. Where's the suspect? I asked. The officer just pointed at the boy. My jaw nearly hit the floor. You're joking, I whispered. This kid is the father. The officer nodded solemnly. The boy had dwarfism and a congenital intellectual disability. He looked much younger than his age. I took the samples, my hands shaking. As I left, Reed saw my pale face. Do the test, she said. The results will tell you everything. Then I'll tell you the why. I went back to the lab and worked through the night. When the results came up, my heart stopped. It was a perfect match. A 10-year-old boy with a disability was indeed the biological father of Sarah's baby. I called Reed immediately. I needed to know how this was even possible. She sighed and began to explain the dark, twisted obsession of a mother named Lisa. Years ago, Lisa had a happy life until her husband passed away from an illness. Since then, she'd been a single mother, utterly devoted to her son. She tried dating, but her son rejected anyone else, so she stayed alone. She was a kind neighbor. but she suffered from severe hypochondria, an irrational fear of illness and death, triggered by the trauma of losing her husband. Lisa's anxiety extended to her son. If he had a tiny scratch, she feared tetanus. If a dog licked him, she feared rabies. A simple cough was surely tuberculosis, but eventually, her obsession turned toward something even stranger. She became convinced that her son's reproductive organs weren't developing properly. She was terrified that he would grow up infertile, and she would never have a grandchild. Doctors told her he was fine, but she didn't believe them. She took him to shady clinics where doctors, happy to take her money, told her he needed supplements for his vitality. She pumped him with various drugs, but she still needed proof. She needed to know if he could actually father a child. And that's when she looked at her best friend, Sarah, and hatched a monstrous plan. Lisa decided to use Sarah as a lab rat for her fertility experiment. Whenever Sarah came over to chat and drink, Lisa would slip sleeping pills into her wine. Once Sarah was unconscious, Lisa would collect her son's semen and inject it into Sarah. She admitted to doing this 5 times, just to be certain. One of those times was exactly when Sarah conceived. On the day it finally worked, Sarah had stopped by Lisa's place, feeling stressed and wanting to talk. Lisa saw her chance. She prepared the experiment one last time, never imagining the chain of events she was about to set off. Sarah had no idea that her kind friend was violating her in the most horrific way possible. All in the name of a mother's twisted love. Sarah felt comfortable with Lisa, never suspecting that her best friend was actually her predator. That night, she drank the spiked wine and fell into a deep, drug-induced sleep. Lisa then carried out her final experiment. She was so focused on her son's health that she completely ignored the life she was destroying. To her, Sarah was just a biological vessel to prove her son's manhood. Months later, when David confronted Sarah about the baby, the truth finally hit Sarah like a freight train. She realized that the only unconscious moments she'd had were at Lisa's apartment. When she and her mother went to Lisa to demand answers, Lisa finally broke down and confessed everything. The shock was too much. That's when Sarah's mother lost control and reached for the hot oil. The settlement for $100,000 wasn't about forgiveness. It was hush money. Lisa paid it hoping Sarah and her mother would keep the horrific truth about her son and her actions a secret. But Officer Reed's persistence ruined everything. As the investigation closed, I realized that the karaoke mystery was just a red herring for a much more disturbing reality. Lisa broke down in tears as she finished her confession. On the day of the attack, Sarah had come over, demanding to know if Lisa's son had been with her. Lisa tried to lie, but Sarah insisted on a paternity test. Realizing she was cornered, Lisa told the truth. That's when Sarah's mother stormed in, grabbed the hot oil from the stove, and threw it in Lisa's face. Lisa admitted that she'd lied to the police initially. She accepted the $100,000 settlement because she was desperate to keep the truth from coming out. She feared that if the world knew what she had done, her son's life would be ruined. She was trapped by her own horrific choices, forced to accept physical disfigurement just to bury her secret. After David abandoned them, Sarah and her mother had put the pieces together themselves. Sarah realized that the only times she had ever blacked out were at Lisa's apartment. She also began to notice a haunting resemblance between her baby and Lisa's son. Confronting Lisa was their last desperate attempt to find the truth before their lives completely unraveled. Once Reed presented the evidence, Sarah and her mother had no choice but to confess everything. The hot oil incident wasn't just a neighbor's quarrel. It was the violent explosion of a year-long deception. As the case closed, I thought I finally understood the full scope of this tragedy. But a few days later, Reed invited me to dinner, hinting that the rabbit hole went even deeper. We met at a new steakhouse in town. Reed was starving and practically inhaled her first 2 steaks before slowing down for the third. "So," she said, wiping her mouth, "you think you figured it all out, Sherlock? You think David's father visiting that day was just a coincidence?" I froze. "What are you talking about? He was just visiting his in-laws." "You missed a huge clue," Reed said. "Remember how David and Sarah met? David's father told him it was an introduction from a friend. But I asked David if he'd ever met that friend. He hadn't. David's father lied to him from the very beginning. He was the one who personally chose Sarah for David." My mind started racing. Why would a father do that? I made a wild guess. Was Sarah the father's mistress? Did he marry her off to his son just to keep her close? Reed laughed. "Close, but no. It wasn't Sarah, it was her mother." I stared at her in disbelief. "Sarah's mother was David's father's long-term mistress." Reed nodded. "And the story of how they met is just as messy as the rest of this. David's father was a wealthy man who loved his freedom. After divorcing David's mother, he had a string of girlfriends. Sarah's mother had come from a poor rural background and ended up working at a massage parlor in the city. She wasn't young, but she was beautiful and knew how to treat a man. David's father fell for her, and she became his favorite. He even set her up with a fake management job in one of his companies so she wouldn't have to work at the parlor anymore. She was grateful and devoted to him, even taking care of him after a major surgery when none of his other mistresses would. Over time, their relationship became more like a marriage than a typical affair. David's father even considered marrying her, but David wouldn't hear of it. Years later, David's father found a new, younger mistress who was incredibly jealous. She demanded he cut ties with all his other women, including Sarah's mother. He didn't want to lose her, but he couldn't stand the drama. So he and Sarah's mother hatched a plan. If their children married, they would be family. He could visit her as the in-law without raising any suspicion from his new girlfriend. Sarah's mother was desperate. She, de-grown, used to the salary David's father paid her, and didn't want to go back to being poor. So she pushed Sarah to marry David. Sarah, who was trying to escape a bad breakup with her first love, the one she'd gotten that plum blossom tattoo with, agreed. She wanted an honest man to take care of her, and David was perfect. David was the only one in the dark. He thought he'd found the love of his life through a lucky introduction. In reality, he was a pawn in a game played by his own father and his mother-in-law. Every time his father came to visit, it wasn't to see the baby or check on the kids. It was to have sex with Sarah's mother in the next room, while Sarah looked the other way. On the day Sarah went to Lisa's and got drugged, David's father had just arrived. He'd sent Sarah out so he could be alone with her mother. Sarah knew exactly what was happening and was disgusted by it. That's why she was so depressed and annoyed when she arrived at Lisa's. She just wanted to drink and forget about her family's filth. She never imagined she was walking into a different nightmare. Sarah never cheated on David at the karaoke bar. She was telling the truth about that. She was a victim of Lisa's insanity, but she was also a co-conspirator in her mother's scheme. She lived a life of lies, helping her mother hide the affair from David just to keep the money flowing. In the end, everyone in David's life was using him for their own selfish ends. As for Sarah's father, he was a ghost of a man, consumed by a gambling addiction. As long as he got his monthly allowance to waste at the tables, he didn't care what his wife or daughter were doing. He was just another parasite feeding off David's hard-earned money and his father's Mistress fund. It was a cycle of exploitation that finally shattered under the weight of its own secrets. David was the most innocent person in this entire saga, and yet he was the one who lost everything. He lost his wife, his child, and the respect he had for his father. He was surrounded by people who saw his kindness and honesty as a weakness to be exploited. It's the ultimate tragedy of the honest man in a world that values only greed and deception. After Reed finished her story, I sat in the restaurant for a long time, unable to finish my meal. I've been in this profession for 11 years and handled tens of thousands of cases, but this one still haunts me. I've seen so many good people get trampled by those they trust the most. It makes you wonder if honesty is a virtue or a curse in a society like this. The child, the only truly innocent being in this mess, will grow up in the middle of a legal and emotional battlefield. The experiment that Lisa conducted out of a twisted sense of love has created a life that no one wanted and a truth that everyone fears. Science gave us the answer to who the father was, but it could never explain the darkness in the human heart. David eventually settled his divorce. He moved far away, cut all ties with his father, and started over. I hope he finds peace, but I know the scars will always be there. He learned the hardest way possible, that the people closest to you can be the most dangerous. This wasn't just a story about a paternity test. It was an autopsy of a family built on lies. As I walk out of the lab tonight, I see another couple waiting for their results. They look nervous, hopeful, even in love. I want to tell them to be careful, to cherish the truth, but I just keep walking. Some stories are better left untold, but this one had to be shared, if only as a warning to those who still believe that everything is as it seems.